A few big headlines. Chief among them, Claire, seems to be that Mitch McConnell has already lost his grip on his caucus. The rules that he made clear last night he had the votes for to not permit any of the evidence from the House investigation into the record. Those have changed already. I think we have a copy of the handwritten changes to the rules that McConnell proposed last night. They've already changed, reportedly, based on reporting to this network and the New York Times, under pressure from Senator Susan Collins and others.
Yeah, you know, they had a caucus lunch, and I think they ate Mitch McConnell's lunch. I think
certainly looks like it.
I think the members that are, and I don't think it was just, I'm predicting if we ever find out, because you're not supposed to talk about what goes on in caucus, but I'm predicting there was more than just Susan Collins. The look was bad, and they knew it. I think Mitch McConnell thought, I can propose this, and once it all starts happening, people will forget that I'm really forcing them to use less time or to go through the middle of the night. I think he just assumed he could get away with that. And I think he assumed he could get away with not admitting the House evidence into evidence automatically. And all he did on that change was what he's done now is say the House record comes in subject to objection of 51 members of the Senate. So the Republicans can still try to pull things out of the record if Mitch has 51 votes. And then finally, what he folded on was a closed session. Clearly, I think there was, whether it was those people from purple states or those people who have tough elections, I just think their offices got bombarded with calls, and I think he decided that this was just a hill too far and to pull back from how draconian the rules had been.
Michael Steele, this was our conversation leading into this, that this is the collision of the politics of being a vulnerable Republican senator in Mitch McConnell's caucus. Mitch McConnell has an iron grip on that caucus until and unless his majority is threatened. Those two things seem to collide pretty dramatically before things even got underway today.
They did. And I think it's interesting to Claire's point that within that caucus, who were the pieces that began to shift and to move on those three changes? And my bet is going to be someone like a Lamar Alexander, who has got a lot of clout and respect inside the caucus. And so I think that if in conversations with Murkowski and others began to realize how this looked, how this weakens the overall argument that Mitch McConnell laid out in the opening about a fair process and a fair trial, to limit it this way, I think that they prevailed in that. I've been in those meetings, in those lunches as national chairman. So you can see how the dynamic around certain issues begin to shift and change if the right voice rises to lead that charge in a different direction.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.